Video games need to introduce new players to their mechanics. It's important to do this in a way that helps the player understand the uses and limitations of the mechanics so that they can develop their skill naturally over time. So as a game designer, you want to come up with a way to foster a comfortable environment for learning and exploration. Ideally, you want to avoid throwing a bunch of text at the player explaining everything, as that can be annoying, and worse, it can rob players of the joy of discovery and self-improvement. One of the best and most classic ways developers do this is by using something called the isolation principle. The first few tutorial shrines in Tears of the Kingdom use this design formula nearly perfectly, and they also show you when and how you might want to deviate from it or adapt it. Let's take a look at how the first few shrines teach you to use each of your 4 new abilities. Maybe once you see this pattern, you'll think of some other games that use it, since it's very common, and that's for a good reason. First up is the Yuko Shrine. This is likely your first shrine and your first new ability, the Ultra Hand. It is the most fundamental ability in the game. It's how you primarily interact with the world. We can use this shrine to explain the 3 main components or steps to the isolation principle. In step 1, you introduce the new gameplay mechanic in a safe and controlled environment. There should be little or no consequences to failure, and it's very direct what you have to do. There's one stone plank, and you basically have to manipulate it so that you can make a bridge across the chasm. There's really nothing else you can even do at this stage. Next, we move on to step 2. The mechanic is developed through repetition. Examples and challenges become harder, and you can reintroduce consequences for failure progressively. Now in the second puzzle here, the single stone plank bridge isn't going to work anymore. But what is the next thing you can do with your Ultra Hand when 2 objects are near each other? You can attach them. It's the same basic solution, but this time you had to put 2 and 2 together on your own. You can start to add in side objectives like the shrine chests up here that allow players to prove their proficiency for bonus rewards. You can think of these like all of the hidden items and levels that you don't need but are important for completion. Lastly, step 3, the mechanic is combined or integrated with other already established mechanics to create new and more complex challenges. Consequences and failures are fully punished now as they would be in the regular gameplay. So now you'll notice there is an actual bottomless pit. You can get hurt and you can die if you fail, so there are higher stakes here. You'll need to combine the things that you learned up to this point to create a new solution. If you have trouble, the shrine gives you a hint here by showing you exactly what you need to build, but even if it didn't, you would have all the necessary components up to this point to help you solve this puzzle. And step 3 doesn't just end with the introduction of a new mechanic. You can think of it like a cycle that continues to happen to the player as they improve over time. When you leave this shrine, what's the next thing you could do? You have 2 options to get to the next island. You can create another rail grinding cart, or you can attach 2 planks to make another extended bridge. So the player develops their skill through repetition, and that never really ends. Next, let's take a look at the second shrine, the In-Isa Shrine. In this one, you get your fuse ability. Step 1 is clearly defined as this first opening room. They give you a weapon and 3 boulders, and you've just learned that you can fuse, and you can't walk past this shattered looking stone wall. What are you going to do? You're obviously going to try to use that ability that you just got and fuse the boulder to the sword. That's the only way forward. It's a simple step 1. Then we have our stretch gold chest up there. Step 2 is when we increase the complexity of the ability. You now realize you can use fuse both for handheld weapons and with archery with your bow and arrow. You can attach elemental effects to your arrows. Finally, we get to step 3, which is a combat encounter. Now this is a new construct that you likely haven't seen, so you can naturally expect that the player is going to seek shelter on one of these platforms. When they get to the top of these platforms, one side has handheld weapons and attachments to increase your damage, the other has a bow and arrow, and some items that add elemental effects to your arrows. This is a perfect display of the final step in the isolation principle by combining your previous knowledge of mechanics to create a new sort of combat puzzle to solve. The idea is that you can use both the environmental effects of items and the increased damage through the fuse ability to make combat scenarios easier. We won't break down each step in the 3rd and 4th shrines, but they still deserve consideration since they show you one way to adapt these ideas. These shrines don't strictly follow the consequence aspect of the isolation principle, but they follow the same general flow of increasingly complex tests in isolation. The reason I think they include less consequences is twofold. Firstly, the ability to ascend and recall aren't really actions you can fail, so it's not important for the player to learn that there should be consequences when you don't use them correctly. The idea was to instead focus on demonstrating just how powerful and extensive these 2 abilities are, so that you're more likely to experiment with them in the world. These last 2 shrines trade in punishing consequences for showcasing creative potential instead, and I think that was a creative reversal of the isolation principle that was used up to that point. This game design idea is just one of the many design aspects layered together in Tears of the Kingdom used to help the player learn, develop, and master their new abilities over time. Have you noticed this design pattern in other games? It's really common in older classic games and Nintendo titles, since they generally like to keep things simple and effective. I'd like to make this part of a series where we break down the game and level design components of the Great Sky Island. I hope to cover how Tears of the Kingdom uses framing and composition to guide players through its open areas between points of interest next.